Thank you all very much. I hardly recognize myself. Now that I left the town with the Foreign Service, as AFSA President Susan Johnson, and we shall miss you. We do the liberators of your life. Thank you for my we thank you on behalf of my friend Tom Boyle, of course. He is a legend in the Foreign Service. There was some references to him. I can give you one more. He battled Henry Kissinger and survived. Now in retirement, he's still battling against injustice and discrimination, protecting Foreign Service personnel. I also want to read the Chilean ambassador, Francisco Bulnes. No, I'm sorry, Felipe Bulnes. Francisco was his grandfather, and he the one I worked with. His grandfather, at the time I was in Chile, was a true friend of the United States in very difficult times. We are very grateful for that. Now, a special greeting to my Fox Hill contingents. They're very numerous, and I appreciate that being here. And last but not least, my greetings to Ambassador Lindbergh, the chairman of the Awards Committee. Thank you very much for nominating me. And now I've always been known as a late bloomer, but you're cutting it awfully short. I'm deeply honored to receive this award. The thought that my name will now join the distinguished list of past recipients is truly comforting. Each of us arrived at this podium by different paths, and I suspect that my path is the most unlikely of all. My presence here today says less about me than about the character of our great country and the fundamental decency of our people. I thought that today I'd briefly share with you some reflection on that unlikely path. Because Tom has already spoken so eloquently about my Foreign Service years, I thought to focus my remarks on the pre- and post-service period. Unlike the other recipients of this award, I did not have the good fortune to be born an American citizen. I was born in Austria, in Vienna. I still remember that when I was about 8 years old, my parents took me to see a documentary called America, the Land of Unlimited Possibilities. And I stand before you today as a living proof of the accuracy of that title. I first entered the United States in July 1941 with a modest job offer from Otis Elevator Company, $25 per week. Within 5 months, after Pearl Harbor, I found myself in an awkward and somewhat ironic position. Otis Elevator had a number of military contracts, and my bosses feared that I would be considered an enemy alien. A quick trip to Washington, my first time here, cleared that up. I walked straight into the Department of Justice, was directed to the appropriate person, and within a few hours, I left with a letter stating that there was no bar to my continued employment. And all this on Christmas Eve, no less. How times have changed. Toward the end of 1942, I was drafted into the Army. Although I never figured out how to pitch a tent and managed to knock over the rifle stacks more often than I hit the target, I actually graduated from Officer Candidate School and eventually was sent back to Europe as a military intelligence officer. I truly became Americanized during those years in the Army, serving among officers and enlisted men from every corner of the country, from an Indian reservation to the Kentucky coal mines. In fact, after I left the active Army, I remained in the reserve for 27 more years. And I'm proud to say that I retired as a full colonel with the right to be buried in Arlington, a fitting end to my American dream. After the war, while still in the Army in Europe, I learned that the State Department was greatly expanding and looking for applicants. I took the Foreign Service entry exam in 1946. I did not hear anything for several months. So I finally checked back with the officer who would give me the exam. He informed me that yes, I had passed, and no, I could not be accepted. It had been a mistake to allow me to take the exam in the first place, because according to regulation in force at that time, an applicant had to have been a citizen for 15 years, and I had been naturalized for only 3. Seeing that I was heartbroken, he said he would forward my exam to Washington, and in 12 more years, I would qualify. I guess that at that time, I still believed in the tooth fairy. Upon leaving the Army, I worked in New York for a shipping and freight forwarding company. And for them, I made several extended trips to Latin America. In the mid-50s, I was offered a lucrative contract by one of our customers and moved to Cali, Colombia. But I've always wondered what had happened to my Foreign Service application and exam. So before renewing my contract in October 1956, I decided to travel to Washington to find out. Not surprisingly, no one had ever heard of my exam. But a very interesting possibility opened up. As a result of complaints by the U.S. business community, the White House had recently authorized the State Department 30 temporary commercial attaché positions, but stipulated that the applicants be selected by the Commerce Department. I remember rushing over from State to Commerce in a fierce Washington rainstorm and arriving there totally drenched and disheveled. But it was a worthwhile trip. By the next morning, I was meeting before a hastily convened board, and by the end of the day, I was accepted, pending the necessary clearances. I returned to Colombia, and in March 1957, the consulate in Cali delivered to me a message signed Dallas. I was so ignorant at the time that I really thought that the Secretary of State personally was offering me a 5-year position as a reserve officer to be commercial attaché in Montevideo, Uruguay. Thus, at age 37, began my unlikely path to this podium. I wasn't kidding about being a late bloomer. I returned to Washington to learn the ropes, including taking a consular course. When we learned about immigration visas, I did very well. I was the only one in the class who knew all the procedures, having received such a visa myself. The new job in Montevideo was a perfect fit. And after 3 years, I took a lateral entry exam into the regular Foreign Service and was accepted. So I guess the first point I wanted to make is that my career really shows that there are many pathways to success in the Foreign Service. Although I waited 14 years after first applying, those years in the private sector came in handy. In some sense, during my entire career, I was always a commercial attaché, because I always believed that promoting and assisting the private sector was a key part of the job. Years later, when George Shultz, another recipient of this award, was Secretary of State, and I was on my way to Venezuela, it was his routine to have a photo opportunity with departing ambassadors in front of a big world globe. He always asked them, "Where is your country?" While they were fumbling around with the globe, Schultz would say, "No," and gleefully point to the United States and say, "There's your country." That was a lesson I never had to learn. That leads me to my second point that I want to make today, which is that the Foreign Service itself provides invaluable preparation for subsequent career. Although I spent a good chunk of my Foreign Service years on political and military matters, including the Spanish and Portuguese space negotiations and dealing with dictators like Stroessner and Pinochet, I never forgot my commercial attaché roots. I've always had very good relations with the American business community, and during the years in both Chile and Venezuela, I became known for being helpful on commercial and financial matters. In 1985, David Rockefeller asked me to take over the Council of the Americas, a non-profit organization in New York that promotes American business and financial interests in the Western Hemisphere. Most Fortune 500 companies with interest in Latin America were members, and there I could continue to do what I had tried to do throughout my entire career: advance and protect U.S. interests abroad. I accepted the offer, and thus, at age 65, I started another career, this time back in the private sector. The council was like an embassy on steroids. Instead of one head of state, I dealt with most leaders from the Western Hemisphere. Whenever they visited the United States, they were eager to meet with our member companies, looking for trade and investment. During the opening week of the United Nations General Assembly, we often had as many as 6 presidents with a few foreign and finance ministers sprinkled in. Now, in the mid-80s, Latin American countries still had tremendous tariff barriers. But the Council tirelessly promoted free trade, urging the various countries to privatize their gigantic money-losing state entities. The U.S. government was on a similar course. Through our member companies, we pushed for congressional approval of fast-track trade agreements, beginning with the one between the United States and Canada. During those days, I learned more than anyone should know about Ontario lumber. Particularly under President Bush 41, another previous winner of this award, we entered a new era in U.S.-Latin American relations. With David Rockefeller's strong interest and strong support from the President and the private sector, we lobbied hard to expand our free trade agreement with Canada to include Mexico, our next largest trading partner. President Bush completed and signed the NAFTA agreement in 1992. President Clinton eventually embraced the idea and skillfully obtained congressional ratification by a narrow margin the following year. I left the Council after 8 years, and I'm happy to report that I helped to persuade the board to name another retired ambassador as my replacement. And then there were 2 more after that, and so on right here. The current president is a respected banker with wide Latin American experience, but the current Washington vice president started out in the Foreign Service. Moreover, the Council's chairman is another retired FSO, former Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte. And even after leaving the job, I continued to advise various American companies doing business in Latin America. Among them is one of the world's largest glass manufacturers, which built several plants in the region in the face of stiff competition from the French, British, and Japanese. So what's new? I was doing the same thing as commercial machinery more than 50 years ago. My point here is that the Foreign Service is a tremendous training ground for doing a variety of things in later life. At every post, you continually learn new things which are invaluable. You can go into the business world, the academic world, the non-profit world, you name it. I can't think of another profession that provides such a great springboard into a second or third or fourth career. I'd like to conclude by saying that the Foreign Service gave me a wonderful and fulfilling life. I was blessed to have my wife Mary always by my side. She belonged to the generation where the government get two for the price of one. And she worked tirelessly to always make the embassy residents attractive and welcoming. Our two sons, Robert and Christopher, went to schools in many countries. Contrary to the common misperception that Foreign Service children dragged from country to country become ruthless and insecure, they grew up to be well-rounded, tolerant, experienced in dealing with other cultures, and multilingual. I'm very proud of them, and I'm happy to say that they're both here today, along with Christopher's wife Caroline, and my grandchildren Nathaniel and Julia. Thank you very much.